Django Reinhardt has been called the greatest guitarist who ever lived. Reinhardt remains the most influential and famous European jazz musician to date. There are arguably a few competitors for this distinction, big-name musicians like John McLaughlin, Joe Zawinul, and Stephane Grappelli, but Reinhardt is the only European jazz musician who was at one point a household name and who changed the course of music itself. Today we're talking all about Django Reinhardt, his technique, and how he changed music. Hello there, it's Warren Hewitt here. I hope you're doing marvellously well. Welcome back to another episode of this series. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and if you hit the notification bell, you'll be notified when we have a new video. Of course you can, if you're into production, go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. During his heyday of the 1930s and 40s, Reinhardt came up with many solo and harmonic innovations on the guitar that had a big impact on modern jazz, blues, country and rock guitar styles. Reinhardt was one of three pre-World War II founding fathers of modern jazz guitar. The other two being Eddie Lang and Charlie Christian. A case could be made that he was to jazz guitar what the great Robert Johnson was to blues and rock guitar. Together with violinist Stephane Grappelli, Reinhardt came up with a completely new European style of jazz, then called gypsy jazz or manouche jazz, by fusing Dixieland, swing jazz, French traditional, gypsy music and more. He was the first to pioneer a form of jazz that centered around the guitar. In sharp contrast with American jazz, which was based around horns, drums and piano, manouche jazz employed guitars, violin and bass. Reinhardt was greatly admired by and played with some of the top American jazz musicians of the time. Legendary names like pianist and band leader Duke Ellington, trumpeters Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie, and saxophonist Coleman Hawkins. As if all these accomplishments were not amazing enough, Reinhardt achieved them while having to overcome obstacles that would have been insurmountable to pretty much anyone else. For starters, he is the ultimate rags to riches story. He was born a Romani, a people who were social and economic outcasts. It meant that Reinhardt had to overcome extreme poverty, illiteracy, and anti-Romani prejudice and persecution. On top of this, there's the truly mind-boggling fact that Reinhardt was a virtuoso guitar player with severely crippled left-hand ring and little fingers. Half his body, including his left hand, was badly damaged in a fire when he was 18 years old, at a point when he was just beginning to gain international fame as a guitar banjo player. One leg was so badly burned, doctors wanted to amputate, and they said he'd never play again. Reinhardt insisted on keeping his leg and playing skills. With great determination, he invented a new way of playing the guitar, performing virtuoso solos with just his index and middle fingers. If the video clips did not exist of him playing extremely fast runs up and down the fretboard, with just two fingers, people would forever doubt the veracity of the two-finger story. Reinhardt's amazing reinvention of himself as a guitarist has inspired countless musicians facing physical challenges. Most famously, in 1965, another young guitarist had an accident at almost the same age. Tony Iommi was only 17 when he lost the tips of his middle and ring fingers in an industrial accident. Like Reinhardt, he was told he'd never play again. However, Iommi's factory foreman insisted on playing him a recording of Reinhardt, and when he told him the lightning-fast runs were executed with just two fingers, Iommi decided to start playing again. Without Django Reinhardt, jazz and rock guitar, as well as European jazz, would today sound very different. Spiritually, he's also one of the ancestors of heavy metal, for without Reinhardt there would have been no Black Sabbath. Django Reinhardt was a man of exceptional talent, courage and determination. However, nothing about his beginnings was exceptional, though some of the roots of his later activities were already in place. He was born in January 1910 in a manouche Romani camp in southern Belgium, taking his first name from his father and his last name from his mother. Jean-Baptiste Weiss was a violinist, a guitarist and a juggler, struggling to make a living as a travelling artist. His wife, Laurence Reinhardt, was a dancer. Their son, Jean-Baptiste Reinhardt, was nicknamed Django. Historians can't decide whether it's a Belgian diminutive of Jean or because Django means I awake in Romani. The youngster spent most of his childhood in Romani camps close to Paris. He had several siblings and his father left the family when he was just 8 years old. Reinhardt started playing violin at an early age and the banjo guitar, a 6-string banjo with the same tuning as a guitar, at age 12. Reinhardt learned quickly from watching the many Romani musicians around him. One taught him to play with the stiff arm technique that created the clear, loud, ringing tone he became known for as an adult player. At age 14, Reinhardt regularly accompanied a popular accordionist of the day, Guerino, playing bal musette in rough, working-class Parisian dance halls. It was not only his first genuine professional assignment, but also proved to be another major influence on his later guitar style. Many elements of Reinhardt's ripping solo phrasing can be traced directly to French dancehall accordion playing. By the time he was 15, Reinhardt was playing Romani and musette music in cafes and scraping a living from music. He had not received any formal musical education and was still illiterate. In fact, he only ever attained the very basics of literacy during his lifetime. In 1927, when he was still only 17, things began to happen for Django Reinhardt. He married Florine Bellarmea, and 2 years later their son Henri was born, nicknamed Luçon, who went on to become a respected Romani guitarist in his own right. Reinhardt started to play banjo guitar in many dancehall bands, and on June the 20th, 1928, made his first recordings, accompanying popular musette accordionist Jean Vassade. Following this, Reinhardt was invited to also record with l'Orchestre Alexandre, Victor Marceau and others. Because of Reinhardt's illiteracy, he didn't realize his first name was misspelt on many of those recordings as Django and Django. By the second half of 1928, Reinhardt's name was beginning to draw international attention. Jack Hilton, famous in the UK as the ambassador of British dance music, came over to France to audition the youngster. Reinhardt accepted Hilton's job offer, and it seemed like the big time was about to happen. However, before he could join Hilton's ensemble, disaster struck. One night, depending on the source, in either late October or early November of 1928, the wagon where Reinhardt and his wife were sleeping caught fire, and he escaped with severe burns over half of his body, with his right leg and left hand particularly badly affected. His ring and little fingers were permanently paralyzed, stuck in a crawl-like position. Doctors wanted to amputate his leg and said he'd never play again. But Reinhardt had other ideas, and he checked himself out of hospital as soon as he could. It took him 18 months to recover, and by the end of it, he still needed a stick to walk. Perhaps the guitar given to him by his younger brother Joseph provided the inspiration for Reinhardt's unbelievable tour de force of willpower during this period, as he set about relearning the guitar with just 2 left-hand fingers. The episode has been described as the turning point in Reinhardt's life. Until the accident, he had been content to play music and instruments as they were presented to him. But he now had to completely reinvent himself. and imagine his way to a new approach to playing the guitar. It led him to devising new shapes, new ways of playing runs, and to use ultra-thin strings, making it easier to play fast and bend notes. Even his two crippled fingers saw occasional use on the high E and B strings for certain chords, but they were never in action during soloing. It was the ultimate case of mind over matter, triumph over adversity, clutching victory from the jaws of defeat, making necessity the mother of invention. It was an unbelievably extraordinary feat. Still, Reinhardt's education was not quite complete. For after his time in hospital, he had no clear purpose, and most of all, he still had never heard jazz. For a while, he travelled through France with his brother Joseph and a new girlfriend, Sophie Nguyen Ziegler, playing in small clubs and barely making a living. The story goes that in 1931, he had a true eureka moment following a cafe gig in the south of France. A well-known painter and photographer, Emile Savitri, heard Reinhardt play and invited him to come and listen to records by Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington and Eddie Lang. The manouche guitar player's mind was well and truly blown. The next crucial stepping stone on his path to greatness and world fame presented himself to Reinhardt soon afterwards. When he returned to Paris that same year, 1931, he met French-Italian jazz violinist Stephane Grappelli, who was in many ways his ideal personal and musical counterpoint. Sophisticated and educated, Grappelli played elegant legato lines on the violin, gliding up to notes extensively in sharp contrast to Reinhardt's frenetic, rhythmic playing. The two immediately hit it off. However, it took until 1934 for the stars to align and Grappelli and Reinhardt to take their place amongst them. One important component was the organisation called Hot Club de France, whose members worshipped American jazz music and organised concerts. At a moment when they were stuck for American musicians, they ran into Reinhardt and Grappelli, who had been playing jam sessions with a band led by bassist Louis Vola. The Hot Club organisation encouraged them to form a permanent group, and the result was the Quintet du Hot Club de France, with Grappelli and Reinhardt backed by guitarists Joseph Reinhardt, Roger Chaput and Louis Vola. The lineup changed over time, with Grappelli and Reinhardt the only constants. Despite some initial resistance among sections of French jazz fans, even at the time there was snobbery about American musicians being superior, the quintet very quickly took France and then Europe by storm. Theirs was a sensational new form of jazz, the first to emerge outside of the US. Recordings by the quintet, released on labels like Decca, Swing, HMV, Ultraphone and Odeon, sold like hotcakes. The quintet toured all over Europe and particularly popular in the UK. At one point, the quintet opened for American jazz star Coleman Hawkins and stole the show. Word of a spectacular group playing a new hot form of jazz with 3 guitarists but no drummer and 2 amazing soloists also reached the US. The roots of the boom-chak rhythms of the gypsy swing quintet of the Hot Club of France can be directly traced to French musette and Romani music, with a strong helping of jazz triplet feel. The harmonies came from jazz and Reinhardt's unusual voicings, often using just 3 strings for each chord. The hot feel was a combination of jazz and musette, while there was also flamenco elements in Reinhardt's soloing, influenced by Spanish Romani, as well as echoes of Hungarian Romani violin playing. The quintet's influences came from many places, and the whole was far more than the sum of the disparate parts. Although Grappelli was a virtuoso and a spellbinding performer, laying the roots of jazz violin all by himself, a lot of the attention went to Reinhardt because his ingenious solos were flash and exciting, and instantly recognizable for the simple reason that it was a completely new way of playing the guitar. No one had ever imagined that the acoustic guitar could be so powerful and incendiary. Reinhardt's level of technique was also far beyond that of any other guitarist at the time, and a revelation. Unbelievably fast chromatic runs, chordal improvisation, large intervals, tremolos, glissandos, arpeggios, octave runs, note bends and harmonics, complex rhythms and impeccable phrasing and timing. Phrasing and note choices that came from musette, flamenco, jazz, and Reinhardt's own wild imagination were all part of his incredible arsenal. His musical imagination also ran wild in over 100 compositions that he wrote, among them classic tunes such as Minor Swing and Manoir de mes Rives. Just the fact that the main soloist in a jazz group was a guitarist and a violinist was a novelty in its own right. The guitar as a solo instrument had never been popular in jazz, for the simple reason that it couldn't be heard over the din of brass instruments, drums, and often piano. The lack of volume problem was solved in the quintet by not using any of these instruments, and by Reinhardt's own right-hand technique and the development of a new type of guitar. Reinhardt's right-hand technique involved him using as hard and thick a pick as he could find, usually made up of natural tortoiseshell, played with a sideways motion emanating from the elbow. It allowed him to play very loudly while maintaining a warm, bell-like tone. Talking about right-hand technique, Reinhardt was the first to use what's now known as sweep picking. Because of his amazing pick control, Reinhardt's playing became a great influence on many American flat-picking guitarists, amongst them Doc Watson, Clarence White, and Tony Rice. With regards to his guitar, for much of his career Reinhardt played a Selmer jazz guitar with a small sound hole, invented by Mario Macaferri, which had a resonator built into its body, resulting in more volume while still capable of subtle nuances. As another famous musician once said, all things must pass. By the end of the 30s, the Quintet du Haut Club de France was the most famous music ensemble in Europe. It could be said that the entire Western world had fallen under the span of Django mania. At this point, as so often in Reinhardt's life, tragedy struck. Though obviously not only to him, but to millions around the world. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 happened when the Quintet was in the UK. Grappelli decided to stay in London, but Reinhardt rushed back to Paris. His reasons for returning to Paris remain unclear, but he immediately faced two big challenges under the Nazi occupation. First of all, being a Romani, and second, being a jazz musician. Like Jews, Romani were persecuted by the Nazis, made to wear ID badges on their clothes and sent to concentration camps. According to modern estimates, more than half of all Romani in Europe were exterminated between 1939 and 1945, in a genocide that Romani called purgement, the equivalent of the Holocaust. On top, the Nazis also frowned heavily on jazz. Reinhardt managed to survive the war, courtesy of his fame. The Nazis in France were more lenient towards his particular version of jazz, and some Nazi officers became fans and protected him. At one point, Reinhardt even thrived, opening his own club, experimenting with guitar amplification and writing a lot of new material, including tunes like Rythme futur, Swing 42 and Nuage. At this point, Reinhardt was also drawing inspiration from French classical composers like Debussy, Ravel and Faux. He married his girlfriend Najine in 1943, and their son Babik was born in 1944. Like his older brother, he became a respected Romani guitarist. French jazz became incredibly popular during the war as a kind of resistance against the occupation, and Reinhardt's tune Nuage became an anthem of the resistance. At the same time, he is often playing to SS men and German soldiers. After 1943, as the Nazis were on the back foot, the mood began to turn sour. Reinhardt tried to escape France twice, but he was captured both times and sent back to Paris. In one case, his life was saved by a jazz-loving Luftwaffe officer. After the war, Reinhardt joined up again with Grappelli, and the two revived the Quintet, recording and touring for a few years, though their collaboration never really caught fire as it had done before in the 30s. One reason was Grappelli was still playing like in the 30s, while Reinhardt had begun experimenting with bebop influences. For this reason, he also performed with his own group, Nouveau Quintet, alone and with various other musicians. Some of his legendary bad habits, like gambling and turning up late or not at all for some concerts, had never quite left him and became stronger again. He just lost a lot of money in a Swiss casino when an invitation came to play in the US for a considerable sum of money. Duke Ellington, who once called Reinhardt the most creative jazz musician to originate anywhere outside the United States, had invited him on a tour with his orchestra. The guitarist was in the US from October 1946 to February 1947. He performed as a special guest soloist with Duke Ellington and his orchestra, and in many other settings. Reinhardt's main challenge was that he had failed to bring his Selmer guitar. He assumed he'd be offered plenty of equally good guitars in the US, but he was presented with a Gibson ES300 and an amplifier. But according to various sources, while his playing was masterful, mastering the amp proved one step too far. Communication with American musicians was not only hampered by language issues, but also the fact that Reinhardt could not read or write music, and apparently had little understanding of key concepts, like what key a piece of music is in. On returning from the US, Reinhardt had no clear direction. There are suggestions that he found it difficult to adapt to the post-war world. He sometimes retreated to his Romani world, and while still performing, his reputation for being unreliable became much stronger. His creative fire had not left him, however, and he continued to experiment with electric pickups, amplification, and bebop influences, and different musical settings. For example, creating an ensemble with bass, piano, and drums. In 1951, he moved to a small town just outside Paris, while still regularly traveling to Paris to perform. On May the 16th, 1953, he died of a brain hemorrhage. He was only 43 years old. Despite his early death and relatively short career, Reinhardt's legacy continues to live on. His playing can be found on between 700 and 1,000 recordings of varying quality, but many of them showcase his playing in all its glory. His legacy can very obviously be found in an entire culture of manouche music and manouche guitar, with manouche festivals all over Europe every summer. However, Reinhardt's influence reaches far beyond the relatively small manouche world, with countless guitarists referencing him and/or being audibly influenced by him in all genres, including classical, jazz, country, bluegrass, blues, folk, and rock. He's been name-checked by scores of other guitarists, from Julian Bream to Les Paul to Chet Atkins to Jimmy Page. In 1973, the Allman Brothers Band recorded a tribute to Reinhardt called Jessica, that was written to be played using just 2 fingers of the left hand and became a staple of the rock genre. Today, it's impossible to find a serious guitarist who has not been influenced by Reinhardt, whether directly or indirectly. Every time someone picks up a guitar and plays a solo, the spirit of Django Reinhardt is in the room. Thank you ever so much for watching the video. Please check out the other videos in the series. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thank you ever so much for watching.